Have you ever felt something watching you from the darkness of the wilderness? Tonight, we're sharing 9 disturbing true stories from the Pacific Northwest that will haunt your dreams. For privacy, names and specific details have been altered, but these encounters are absolutely real. From unexplained disappearances to creatures that defy explanation, these accounts come from people who survived the unthinkable. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Unheard Fears for more terrifying true stories every week. My name is Louie, and what I'm about to tell you happened in October 2019, while I was working as a Forest Service radio dispatcher at Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington. I've been doing this job for 12 years now, handling everything from routine check-ins to genuine emergencies, coordinating search and rescue operations, and guiding lost hikers back to safety through nothing but radio waves and calm instructions. I thought I had heard it all until the transmissions started coming in from Michelle that afternoon near Spirit Lake. What happened during those final hours still keeps me up at night, and no amount of rational explanation has ever been able to account for what I heard through that radio or what the search teams found afterward. Michelle was one of our most experienced rangers, someone who had been patrolling these forests for nearly 15 years. She knew every trail, every dangerous spot, every place where inexperienced hikers might get themselves into trouble. On October 14th, she radioed in at exactly 1400 hours for her routine trail inspection near the Spirit Lake area. The weather was clear, temperature hovering around 52 degrees, and visibility was excellent. There was absolutely no reason to expect anything other than a standard patrol report. Her voice came through crisp and professional as always, confirming her position and estimated time for the next check-in. I logged it in the system like I had done thousands of times before and moved on to monitoring other channels. Everything was completely normal for exactly 93 minutes. When Michelle's voice crackled through the speaker again at 15:33 hours, something was immediately different. The signal was distorted, breaking up in ways that didn't match any atmospheric interference I had encountered in over a decade of dispatch work. Her words came through fragmented, with strange echoing effects that made it sound like multiple versions of her voice were speaking slightly out of sync with each other. She reported finding abandoned camping equipment approximately 2 miles off the main trail, gear that looked recently used, but was covered in some kind of crystalline substance she couldn't identify. The way she described it sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine even then. She said it looked like frost, but felt warm to the touch through her gloves, and when she leaned closer to examine it, tiny particles became airborne, and she could taste something metallic on her tongue, even though her mouth was closed. I advised her to move away from the equipment and mark the coordinates for a proper investigation team, standard protocol for potential biohazard situations. Michelle acknowledged and confirmed she was stepping back, but then her transmission continued with details that made absolutely no sense. She described seeing her own figure standing completely motionless about 50 yards ahead on the trail. Not someone who looked similar to her, but herself, wearing the exact same uniform, same gear, same everything. She actually laughed nervously when she first said it, like she was waiting for me to tell her she was seeing things or that it was just another hiker. But her laughter died quickly when she zoomed in with her binoculars and saw that the figure's name tag read her name, and the figure was staring directly back at her without blinking or moving at all. The distortion in her signal grew worse, and I started hearing her voice calling out from what sounded like the wrong direction in the background of her own transmission. She was asking herself if she was okay, but the Michelle on the radio was clearly not the one asking the question. She started breathing faster, and I could hear genuine fear creeping into her tone, something I had never encountered from her even during serious emergency situations. She reported that the temperature had dropped dramatically within seconds, so severely that her breath was crystallizing in the air before it even left her mouth completely. She described watching ice crystals form mid-exhale and fall to the ground like tiny glass shards. The thermometer on her gear showed 38 degrees, but she swore it felt closer to 0. I immediately initiated emergency protocols and dispatched the nearest patrol unit to her location, but we were looking at a minimum 45-minute response time given how remote her position was. I stayed on the radio with her, trying to keep her talking, trying to keep her calm and grounded. She kept describing impossible things in between bursts of static. The smell of ozone was overwhelming, she said, mixed with something organic and rotting like vegetation that had been decomposing for years. The combination was making her nauseous. She moved away from the abandoned campsite, trying to put distance between herself and whatever was happening, but the distortions in reality seemed to follow her. At 1600 hours, her transmission became almost unintelligible. Through the static and interference, I could hear what sounded like wet tearing sounds, like fabric being ripped apart slowly and deliberately. Michelle was whispering now, her voice barely audible, and I had to turn the volume up to maximum to make out her words. She said the figure that looked like her was closer now, even though she had been moving in the opposite direction. It was keeping pace with her somehow, always maintaining that same 50-yard distance. But now, she could see that something was wrong with its face. The features were hers, but they were shifting slightly, like looking at a reflection in disturbed water. The mouth moved wrong, opening wider than it should be able to, and the eyes didn't blink in any natural rhythm. Then Michelle whispered something that still echoes in my mind years later. She said my name slowly, carefully, and then continued with words that froze my blood. She told me it was wearing her face, but it wasn't attached right. She could see the edges lifting, peeling away, like a mask that didn't quite fit properly. The transmission cut to pure static for nearly 30 seconds, and when it came back, all I could hear was breathing and those wet, tearing sounds continuing in the background. I was shouting into the radio, trying to get her to respond, trying to get any indication that she was still there and still okay. The emergency response team was moving as fast as they could, but they were still 20 minutes out from her last known coordinates. The final transmission came through at 16:12 hours. Michelle's voice returned, but it sounded flat and emotionless, completely devoid of the fear that had been escalating for the past 40 minutes. She stated her exact GPS coordinates with perfect clarity, no static, no distortion, and then she said something that made my hands shake. She told me that it knows everything she knows, that it had been learning from her, studying her, becoming her. Before I could respond, before I could ask her what she meant, or tell her to run or do anything at all, the signal died completely. Not static, not interference, just absolute silence like the radio had been switched off. I tried raising her for the next 18 minutes straight, cycling through every frequency, but there was nothing. The search team reached her coordinates at 16:47 hours. They found her radio equipment sitting on a flat rock, still powered on but transmitting nothing. Her backpack was nearby, contents neatly arranged, as if she had carefully unpacked everything and laid it out for inspection. But Michelle herself was gone. The team expanded their search radius immediately, bringing in additional units and a helicopter with thermal imaging. They found footprints that matched her boots, but the trail was bizarre. The prints would continue for 20 or 30 yards in one direction, then appear to start over from a completely different location with no indication of how she had gotten from point A to point B. It was like watching someone teleport in random intervals across the forest floor. 3 days into the search, one of the team members found her body camera attached to a tree branch about a mile from where her equipment had been discovered. The camera was still recording, memory card completely full. When the technical team reviewed the footage back at headquarters, most of it was exactly what you would expect from a routine trail inspection. Michelle documenting the path conditions, noting any hazards, recording wildlife signs. But the final 18 minutes of footage were something else entirely. The video showed only static and brief flashes of imagery that didn't correspond to anything in our reality. Geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, angles that seemed to exist in more dimensions than should be possible, and in a few frames that lasted less than a second each, multiple versions of Michelle standing in a circle facing each other. The official report classified her as missing, presumed dead, though no body was ever recovered. The area where she disappeared was quietly restricted, marked as hazardous terrain on official maps with vague warnings about unstable ground conditions. But I know the real reason. 2 other rangers reported similar phenomena in the following months. They described seeing figures that looked like themselves, areas where temperature dropped impossibly fast, and that same crystalline substance on abandoned equipment. Both rangers were pulled from patrol duty immediately, and the entire sector was declared off-limits indefinitely. I still worked dispatch, still monitored those radio frequencies, but something changed after Michelle's disappearance. Sometimes, during overnight shifts when the building is quiet and most of the channels are silent, I hear fragments of transmissions that shouldn't exist. They're brief, never more than a few seconds. But I recognize Michelle's voice. She's still reporting her position, still describing what she sees, but the coordinates she gives don't correspond to any location on our maps. The dates she references are months or years out of sync. Sometimes she mentions my name, asking if I'm receiving her transmission, asking if help is coming. I've never reported these phantom transmissions to anyone. What would I say? That I'm receiving radio signals from someone who disappeared years later. That the voice sounds exactly like her, but the words suggest she's experiencing time in a completely non-linear way. The technical explanation would be that I'm hearing delayed echoes bouncing off the atmosphere, or interference from other radio sources, or that my mind is playing tricks after the trauma of losing someone I worked with for years. But I know what I hear. I know Michelle is still out there somewhere, still trying to call for help, still hoping someone will guide her back to safety through nothing but radio waves and calm instructions. And every time I hear those fragmented transmissions, I respond. I give her the same professional confirmation I gave her on October 14th, 2019. I tell her that her signal is received, that help is on the way, that she just needs to stay calm and maintain her position. Even though I know she disappeared into something that doesn't follow the rules of our world, even though I know my words are reaching across some barrier that shouldn't exist, I keep responding. Because that's what you do in this job. You never stop trying to bring them home. My name is Elian, and I've worked as a timber cruiser for a logging company in Oregon for the past 8 years. For those who don't know what that means, I'm essentially the person who goes into remote forest sections to conduct tree inventories, measuring diameter, height, and overall health to determine which areas are suitable for harvest. It's solitary work that takes me deep into places where most people never set foot, and I've always preferred it that way. The silence, the isolation, the feeling of being completely alone with nature. That all changed in March 2015 when I was conducting a routine survey in the Siuslaw National Forest along the Oregon Coast Range. What I discovered in that old growth section has fundamentally altered my understanding of what can exist in these ancient woods, and the physical evidence I tried to bring back dissolved before anyone else could see it. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. I was tasked with surveying a remote old growth section that hadn't been evaluated in over 20 years, an area the company was considering for potential selective harvest. The weather that morning was typical for coastal Oregon in early spring, overcast with a light drizzle that made everything smell like wet earth and Douglas fir. I parked my truck at the access road terminus around 7 in the morning and hiked in with my gear, GPS unit, diameter tape, clinometer, and standard survey equipment. The first few hours went exactly as expected. I marked waypoints, measured trees, recorded data, and gradually worked my way deeper into the section following the predetermined grid pattern. Around noon, I noticed something unusual. There was an unmarked trail cutting through the survey area, which shouldn't have existed according to any of the maps or previous survey records I had reviewed. The trail itself wasn't particularly remarkable at first glance, just a narrow path through the undergrowth that looked like it had been used recently based on the lack of debris. But what caught my attention was the bark on the surrounding trees. When I touched it to mark a measurement point, the bark felt unnaturally warm despite the cool, damp air. I pressed my palm against it more firmly and felt something that made my stomach turn. The tree was pulsing, a slow rhythmic throb like a heartbeat running through the wood itself. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct I had developed over years of working in these forests was telling me to mark the location and return with a forestry biologist to investigate. But curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the trail to see where it led. The warmth in the surrounding trees intensified the further I went, and I noticed the air itself seemed to grow thicker, heavier, carrying a smell that reminded me of copper mixed with fermenting fruit. It was sweet and metallic at the same time, coating the back of my throat and making it difficult to breathe normally. The trail opened into a small clearing dominated by a massive hollow cedar, easily 12 feet in diameter at the base. The tree had clearly been dead for decades, its interior completely hollowed out by rot and time, but something was living inside it now. Through the opening in the trunk, I could see movement, a writhing mass that filled the entire hollow cavity. At first, I thought it might be some kind of animal den, maybe a bear or a cluster of smaller creatures. But as I approached, and my eyes adjusted to the darkness inside, I realized what I was looking at couldn't be explained by any natural wildlife. The mass was composed of human tissue, grotesquely merged together into a single living organism. I could see skin textures, muscle fibers, bone structures, all seamlessly grafted and woven into each other like some kind of biological tapestry. The whole thing moved with slow, deliberate undulations, expanding and contracting as if breathing. The smell of copper intensified so strongly that I could taste it on my tongue, mixing with that sickly sweet fermentation odor that now made me want to vomit. I stumbled backward, my boot catching on a root, and that's when I saw the faces. Embedded throughout the mass were human faces, dozens of them, their features pressed against the surface of the tissue like people trapped beneath a membrane. Some were distorted beyond recognition, stretched and compressed into impossible configurations. Others were perfectly preserved, their eyes closed as if sleeping peacefully despite being part of this nightmare. One face near the center opened its eyes and looked directly at me. The lips moved, forming my name silently at first, then with increasing volume until I could hear it whispered from inside the hollow tree. But I had never told anyone in this forest my name. I had never been here before. Then recognition hit me like a physical blow. The face belonged to a woman I remembered from news reports back in 2008, a hiker who had disappeared in this general area during a solo backpacking trip. Her picture had been all over local media for weeks, search teams combing the forest without finding any trace. And here she was, or what remained of her, merged into this living mass of tissue inside a hollow cedar. Her lips continued moving, and now I could make out words between the whispers of my name. She was asking for help, begging to be released, promising anything if I would just make it stop. I tried to run, but only made it 3 steps before something wrapped around my ankle. Looking down, I saw a pale tendril extending from the mass inside the tree, thin as a finger, but incredibly strong. It had somehow stretched across 15 feet of open ground and latched onto my leg. I could feel it burrowing through my jeans, pressing against my skin with enough force to break through. The pain was immediate and sharp, like a hot needle pushing into muscle tissue. I grabbed my pocket knife with shaking hands and cut at the tendril, sawing through the rubbery flesh until it separated. Clear fluid mixed with something darker sprayed from the severed end, and the taste of bile and iron filled my mouth as I gagged. The portion still attached to my ankle writhed for a few seconds before going still, and I used the knife to pry it away from my skin. Where it had been trying to burrow in, I could see a small puncture wound already turning an ugly purple color around the edges. I shoved the severed piece of tendril into a sample bag, along with a small tissue fragment I managed to cut from the main mass while it was recoiling. Then I ran. I didn't follow the trail back, didn't care about maintaining my survey grid, just crashed through the undergrowth in what I hoped was the direction of my truck. I made it back to the access road in half the time it had taken me to hike in, adrenaline pushing me forward even as my injured ankle throbbed with every step. I drove straight to the nearest hospital, babbling to the emergency room staff about contamination and unknown biological hazards. They cleaned and bandaged the wound, gave me a tetanus shot and a course of antibiotics, and strongly suggested I speak with a mental health professional. While I was being treated, I kept the sample bag with me, clutching it like evidence that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. But when I finally opened the bag to show the doctor, there was nothing inside except black fluid, thick and oily like motor oil, but with that same copper and fermentation smell. The solid tissue I had collected had somehow dissolved completely during the drive and examination. The doctor ran tests on the fluid, but the results came back as inconclusive, showing traces of organic compounds that didn't match any known biological markers. Without physical evidence, my story sounded exactly like what the hospital staff clearly believed it was, a hallucination brought on by isolation and possibly environmental toxins. I returned to the location 3 days later with forestry officials and local law enforcement. I had the exact GPS coordinates, could describe the trail and the hollow cedar in perfect detail. But when we arrived, there was nothing. No unmarked trail, no warm pulsing bark, no massive hollow cedar. The section looked exactly like every other part of the old-growth forest, untouched and pristine. The officials were polite but clearly skeptical, suggesting I had gotten turned around or confused my location. The logging company quietly reassigned me to different survey areas after that, and the Siuslaw section was marked as low priority, effectively shelving any harvest plans indefinitely. I still have the scar on my ankle where that tendril tried to burrow into my flesh. Sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I swear I can feel it pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. I've done research, spent hours digging through missing persons reports from the Pacific Northwest going back decades. There are dozens of cases, maybe hundreds, of people who vanished in remote forest areas without a trace. I think about that woman's face pressed against the tissue mass, asking for help, and I wonder how many others are out there in hollow trees scattered through these woods. I wonder if that mass is still growing, still collecting, still waiting for the next person to wander down an unmarked trail. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't cut that tendril away in time, if I would have become just another face embedded in that living nightmare, whispering names to passing strangers and begging for a release that never comes. Have you ever found something in the woods that made you question everything you thought you knew about nature? Share your experience in the comments below. My name is Samantha, and I work as a fish and wildlife biologist specializing in salmon population studies throughout the Pacific Northwest. September 2021 found me stationed at a remote monitoring facility along the Hoh River in Olympic National Forest, Washington, conducting the annual census during spawning season. This work requires patience and attention to detail, spending long hours observing fish movements through underwater cameras and manual counts at strategic points along the river. I've always found it meditative, watching the ancient cycle of salmon returning upstream to complete their life journey. That perspective shattered completely during a week in mid-September, when the salmon began moving in patterns that violated every principle of biology I had spent years studying, and something beneath the river's surface revealed itself in ways that left me temporarily blind and permanently changed. The monitoring station sits about 8 miles upstream from the nearest road access, a small cabin equipped with observation equipment, water filtration systems, and supplies for extended stays. I had been there for 5 days when the abnormalities started, conducting night observations using infrared cameras and specialized lighting that doesn't disturb the fish. The salmon runs had been robust that year, thousands of fish making their way upstream in waves that peaked during evening hours. Everything appeared normal until September 16th, just after midnight, when I noticed the movement patterns shifting into something geometrically precise. Instead of the natural, somewhat chaotic flow you expect from migrating fish, the salmon were swimming in formations that formed perfect circles, spirals, and angular shapes that actually hurt my eyes to observe directly. I thought perhaps the camera was malfunctioning, creating visual artifacts that made random movements appear structured. But when I stepped outside to observe with my own eyes using a high-powered spotlight, the patterns were even more pronounced. Hundreds of salmon moving in absolute synchronization, creating designs in the water that shifted and evolved with mathematical precision. The sight made my head ache, a dull throbbing pressure building behind my eyes the longer I watched. I went back inside and reviewed the recorded footage from earlier in the evening, trying to pinpoint when the behavior had changed. Around 11:47, the fish movements transitioned from normal to synchronized within the span of 3 minutes. But there was something else on the footage that I had missed during live observation. Beneath the salmon, barely visible in the infrared spectrum, was a shadow. Not the shadow cast by something blocking light, but a presence in the water itself, massive and moving with deliberate intent. The shape was wrong, proportions that didn't match any known aquatic species, and the way it moved suggested intelligence rather than instinct. I increased the camera's sensitivity and adjusted the angles to get a better view of the river bottom. What I captured over the next hour defied rational explanation. The shadow would surface occasionally, never fully breaching the water, but creating disturbances that sent ripples across the entire width of the river. Each time it rose closer to the surface, the salmon formations became more complex, their synchronized movements creating sounds through the water that my hydrophones picked up clearly. It wasn't random noise or typical fish communication. The audio playback revealed something that sounded disturbingly like chanting, rhythmic vocalizations produced by hundreds of fish moving their gills in perfect unison. By 2 in the morning, I realized the water itself was changing. When I collected a sample for routine quality testing, the taste was different, even through my filtration system. There was a bitter, almost alkaline quality that hadn't been present in previous samples. My electronic equipment started displaying irregularities, temperature readings fluctuating wildly, pH sensors showing impossible values, and the computer monitors occasionally flickering with symbols I didn't recognize. They looked almost like mathematical notation, but in a form I had never encountered despite my advanced degrees in biology and ecology. I decided to document everything methodically, treating it like any other scientific observation, even though nothing about the situation fit within known parameters. I logged the timestamps, took water samples at 15-minute intervals, recorded audio and video continuously, and made detailed notes about every anomaly. Around 3:30 in the morning, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. I had been counting and cataloging individual fish as part of the standard census protocol, using distinctive markings and fin damage to track specific specimens. But I kept recording the same fish over and over again. Not similar fish, the exact same individuals with identical marking patterns, passing through the observation point repeatedly, as if caught in some kind of loop. The realization that the salmon were cycling through an impossible pattern made me step back from the monitors and reassess everything. I pulled up the GPS data from my equipment to confirm my location, worried somehow I had made a fundamental error in setting up the monitoring station. But the coordinates were correct, matching the predetermined survey site exactly. The river was where it should be. The cabin was positioned properly. Everything was physically correct except for what was happening in the water. At 4:15, the massive shadow beneath the surface rose higher than it had all night. For just a moment, less than 3 seconds according to the timestamp on my recordings, it broke through the waterline. I was looking directly at it through the observation window when it surfaced, and the glimpse I caught of its form triggered an immediate physical reaction. Blood poured from my nose in a sudden rush, and my vision went completely white. Not dark, but blinding white light that seemed to come from inside my skull rather than external sources. The pain was instantaneous and overwhelming, like someone had driven an ice pick through both temples simultaneously. I collapsed backward, knocking over my chair and cracking my head against the cabin floor. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When awareness returned, pale dawn light was filtering through the windows, and my face was crusted with dried blood. My vision was still compromised, everything appearing washed out and indistinct like looking through frosted glass. I managed to pull myself up and check the monitoring equipment. All of it was still running, cameras recording, sensors collecting data. But when I tried to review the footage from when the shadow had surfaced, the files were corrupted. Not deleted or missing, but filled with cascading data that created images of spaces that shouldn't exist, angles and dimensions that made my damaged vision even worse when I tried to comprehend them. The salmon were still there, still moving through the observation point, but their behavior had returned to normal natural patterns. The synchronized formations were gone. The chanting sounds had ceased, and the water samples I tested showed standard chemistry readings. It was as if nothing unusual had happened at all except for my nosebleed, my compromised vision, and the corrupted data files that proved something had occurred, even if they couldn't show what. I radioed for early extraction that morning, claiming equipment malfunction and possible medical issues. The backup biologist who arrived to relieve me found everything in working order, all sensors reading normally, all cameras functioning perfectly. She reviewed the uncorrupted portions of my recordings and saw nothing but typical salmon migration behavior. When I tried to explain the synchronized patterns and the shadow beneath the water, she suggested very diplomatically that isolation and night shift work can sometimes create perceptual distortions, especially when staring at monitors for extended periods. My vision gradually improved over the following weeks, but it never fully returned to normal. I see things in my peripheral vision now that disappear when I look directly at them, shadows that move with purpose and shapes that don't conform to three-dimensional space. Medical scans showed unusual activity in my visual cortex, patterns of neural activation that the neurologist described as resembling language centers lighting up when I process visual information, as if my brain is trying to read something in what I see. The monitoring program quietly abandoned that particular station after my replacement reported similar phenomena during her first night alone. She described the salmon forming geometric patterns and hearing vocalizations that sounded like speech in a language she couldn't identify. She lasted 4 hours before requesting immediate evacuation. The official explanation cited structural concerns with the facility and potential environmental contamination in that section of river. But I know the truth. Something lives in those waters, something massive and ancient that exists in ways we can't fully perceive. The salmon know it's there, respond to it, become extensions of whatever intelligence moves beneath the surface. I still work as a biologist, but I've moved to laboratory research and data analysis, positions that keep me away from remote field stations and prolonged observation duties. Sometimes I dream about that night, about the moment when the shadow surfaced and my mind tried to process what I was seeing. In those dreams, I understand the equations that appeared on my corrupted monitors, comprehend the language the salmon were speaking through their synchronized gill movements. And in those dreams, I know that what lives in the Ho River isn't isolated to that location. It's part of something larger, a network of consciousness that stretches through waterways across the entire Pacific Northwest, watching us through the eyes of migrating fish and waiting for something I hope never comes. If you work alone in remote locations, have you ever experienced something that made you question whether you were really alone? Tell me what happened in the comments. My name is Cairo, and back in August 2003, I was driving long-haul trucks across the western states, spending more time on the road than anywhere else. The isolation never bothered me much. In fact, I preferred it to dealing with warehouse staff and dispatch offices. Just me, the highway, and whatever audiobook or music I felt like playing. That preference for solitude ended during a delivery run through the Willamette Valley backroads in Oregon, when I took a shortcut that led me to witness something that still haunts me 20 years later. What I saw that night in the valley proved that some communities hide secrets far older and stranger than anything you could imagine. And those secrets walk among us wearing human faces that aren't quite what they appear to be. The delivery schedule had me running behind after a delay at the previous drop-off point in Eugene. I was hauling refrigerated produce destined for a distributor in Salem, and the clock was ticking on my arrival window. Rather than stick to the main highways, where construction had traffic backed up for miles, I decided to cut through the rural valley roads based on a route suggestion from another driver I had talked to at a rest stop. He swore it would save me 40 minutes, and at that point, I needed every minute I could get. The turnoff came just after midnight, a 2-lane county road that wound through farmland and scattered patches of forest. The first 30 minutes were uneventful, exactly what you'd expect from rural Oregon at night. Dark fields on either side, the occasional farmhouse set back from the road with porch lights glowing, and almost no other traffic. Then I came around a bend and had to hit the brakes hard. There were people walking in the middle of the road, at least 20 of them spread across both lanes, all moving in the same direction toward a tree line about half a mile distant. They weren't dressed for a midnight hike. These were people in regular clothes, jeans and t-shirts, light jackets, the kind of casual wear you'd see at a grocery store or gas station. But they were walking with absolute purpose, completely silent, ignoring my truck even as the headlights illuminated them. I laid on the horn, expecting them to scatter or at least acknowledge my presence. Nobody reacted. They just kept walking at that same steady pace, and I had no choice but to slow to a crawl and navigate around them. As I passed, I got a good look at their faces in the side mirrors. Blank expressions, eyes fixed straight ahead, moving with mechanical precision. It was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, like watching people sleepwalk in perfect formation. The whole group gave off an atmosphere that made the hair on my neck stand up. About a quarter-mile past where I had encountered the walkers, a child stepped directly into my headlight beams. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the truck's lights. I slammed on, the brakes, the entire rig shuddering as the air brakes engaged. She stood there perfectly still, staring up at the cab, and I sat frozen with my hands gripping the wheel, so tight my knuckles went white. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 seconds, I opened the door and climbed down, intending to find out what a child was doing alone on a deserted road in the middle of the night. Up close, she looked normal enough. Brown hair, freckles across her nose, bare feet covered in dust from the road. But when she spoke, her voice had a quality that didn't match her appearance. Older somehow, with an accent I couldn't place. She asked me a single question in a tone that was completely casual, as if we were having a conversation in broad daylight at a park. She wanted to know if I was pure. Not pure in any specific context, just that one word. Are you pure? The way she emphasized it made it clear she was asking about something specific, something she expected me to understand. I didn't know how to answer that. I asked her where her parents were, whether she needed help, all the standard questions any adult would ask a child alone at night. She ignored every question and repeated her own. Are you pure? The smell hit me then, wood smoke and dried flowers, completely out of place on an empty road. It was coming from her, or from her direction, strong enough that I could taste the bitter floral notes at the back of my throat. I told her I needed to call someone, that she shouldn't be out here alone, and turned back toward the truck to grab my cell phone. She was gone when I turned back around, just vanished in the 3 seconds it took me to reach for the cab door. I called out, scanning the roadside with my flashlight, but there was no trace of her. No footprints in the dust, no sound of movement through the brush, nothing. My rational mind tried to explain it away, as the kid running off into the darkness while I was distracted. But something deeper, some instinct I hadn't even known I possessed, was screaming at me to get back in the truck and drive. Instead, I did possibly the stupidest thing I've ever done. I followed the direction those walkers had been heading, wanting to understand what I had stumbled into. I parked the truck on a wide shoulder and followed on foot, keeping to the tree line and using my flashlight sparingly. The group of walkers had reached their destination, a massive oak tree standing alone in a clearing about 200 yards from the road. They had formed a circle around the trunk, and I positioned myself behind a fallen log where I could observe without being seen. What happened next destroyed any possibility of rational explanation. The people began removing their skin, not violently, not like peeling or tearing, but methodically, as if they were taking off clothing. They reached up to their faces and lifted, and the human exterior came away in single pieces. Beneath what I had assumed were normal people were figures constructed from bundled sticks, dried plant matter, and woven fibers. They moved with the same fluid grace as before, but now I could see the truth. These weren't people at all. They were something else, wearing human appearance like a disguise, and they were gathering for some kind of ceremony beneath that ancient oak. I watched as they arranged their shed skins carefully on the ground and began circling the tree, their stick figure forms clicking and rustling with each movement. They were chanting, a low rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the fibers of their construction, rather than from mouths or throats. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath, and frost began forming on the fallen log where I was hiding. I pressed my hand against the rough bark to steady myself, and the wood felt ice cold, cold enough that it left what looked like frost burns across my palm when I pulled away. The ceremony lasted maybe 20 minutes, though time felt distorted and unreliable. When it concluded, the figures returned to their shed skins, stepping back into the human exteriors and sealing themselves inside as if zipping up a suit. Within moments, they looked exactly like the people I had seen walking down the road, ordinary in every visible way. They dispersed in different directions, heading toward the scattered farmhouses I had passed earlier, walking with that same purposeful stride. I stayed hidden for another 10 minutes after the last one disappeared, then ran back to my truck faster than I've ever moved in my life. My keys felt wrong in my hand, the metal so cold it burned my fingers and left actual frost marks on my skin. The engine turned over on the first try, but every warning light on the dashboard lit up simultaneously before flickering back to normal. I drove straight through to Salem without stopping, my hand shaking on the wheel the entire way. When I arrived at the distribution center, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The delivery manifest, the paperwork that listed every detail of my cargo and route, had been altered. My name appeared on a separate sheet stapled to the back under a header that read Next Harvest, with a date listed for August 2024. I showed it to the warehouse supervisor, but he said it looked like a printing error, probably a glitch in the automated scheduling system. He removed the page and threw it away without any concern. That was 22 years ago, and I'm still driving trucks. I've taken that same route through the Willamette Valley dozens of times since then, during daylight and at night, and I always see them. The same people, unchanged by the passage of 2 decades. They're working in the fields, sitting on farmhouse porches, shopping at the small country stores that dot the back roads. They look at me when I pass, and I know they recognize me. I know they're waiting to see if that harvest date will come to pass, if I'll eventually become whatever it is they need me to be. I've researched the area obsessively, digging through historical records and local folklore. There are stories going back over 100 years about the valley communities, whispered rumors of families that never seem to age, of traditions maintained in secret, of people who move through the world but aren't truly part of it. Nobody takes those stories seriously. They're dismissed as rural legends, the kind of tales every agricultural region develops over time. But I know the truth. I've seen what walks among us wearing borrowed faces, and I know that ancient oak still stands in that clearing, waiting for the next ceremony, the next gathering of things that only pretend to be human. Have you ever driven through a small town and felt like something was fundamentally wrong, even though everything looked normal? Share what you sensed in the comments. My name is Amy, and until November 2016, I made my living as a commercial mushroom forager in the Pacific Northwest, specializing in rare and valuable species like matsutake, chanterelles, and Oregon black truffles. It's competitive work that takes you deep into territories most people avoid, racing against other foragers to find the best spots before they're picked clean. I had been doing it successfully for 7 years, knew the forests around Cascade Head in Cieslaw National Forest better than my own neighborhood, and prided myself on discovering locations nobody else had mapped. That confidence nearly destroyed everything when I found a cluster of mushrooms that should have been impossible, specimens that hummed with their own internal frequency and set in motion a contamination I'm still trying to understand years later. November is truffle season in Oregon, when the commercial buyers pay premium prices, and serious foragers can make enough in a few weeks to cover months of expenses. Competition gets fierce during peak season, with foragers guarding their best locations jealously and venturing into increasingly remote areas to find untapped resources. I had been working a grid pattern through a section of old-growth forest near Cascade Head, using a trained eye and years of experience to spot the subtle soil disturbances that indicate truffle growth beneath the surface. The weather had been perfect for weeks. Consistent rainfall followed by clear days that create ideal conditions for fungal fruiting bodies to develop. 3 days into my survey, I ventured off-trail into an area I had never explored before, following a hunch based on the tree species composition and soil drainage patterns. The terrain was difficult, steep slopes covered in deadfall and thick undergrowth that required constant attention to navigate safely. But something was pulling me forward, an instinct I couldn't name that insisted I needed to keep going, despite the challenging conditions. After nearly an hour of bushwhacking through dense vegetation, I emerged into a small depression surrounded by Sitka spruce, and that's when I saw them. What I discovered made me forget about truffles entirely. In the center of the depression, there was a cluster of mushrooms unlike anything I had seen in my career or in any mycological guide I had studied during my training. They were beautiful in an unsettling way, caps showing iridescent colors that shifted as I moved around them, displaying purples and greens and blues that seemed to glow with internal light. The gills were so perfectly formed they looked artificial, arranged with geometric precision that didn't match the organic irregularity you typically see in wild fungi. But what really captured my attention was the sound. The entire cluster was producing a faint humming noise, a vibration I could feel in my chest, even before I consciously registered hearing it. The frequency made my teeth ache and created a pressure sensation behind my eyes that intensified the closer I approached. I should have photographed them and contacted a university mycologist immediately. These were clearly an undocumented species, potentially a significant scientific discovery that could advance our understanding of fungal biology. But the commercial forager in me saw dollar signs. Rare specimens could fetch extraordinary prices from private collectors and high-end restaurants willing to pay for exclusivity and the prestige of serving something nobody else could obtain. I carefully harvested several mushrooms, noting their unusual weight and the warm sensation they produced even through my thick foraging gloves. They felt alive in a way that went beyond normal fungal biology, maintaining a temperature at least 15 degrees above the ambient forest air, and pulsing slightly with that internal rhythm that matched the humming frequency. I had a contact in Portland, a mycologist named Cohen, who worked privately consulting for pharmaceutical companies, interested in novel fungal compounds with potential medical applications. We had done business before when I had found unusual specimens, and I trusted his discretion and his willingness to pay fair prices for valuable discoveries. I called him from the forest, describing what I had found in vague terms to protect my location, and he agreed to examine samples immediately. His excitement was obvious even through the poor cell reception, his voice rising with enthusiasm as I described the iridescent coloring and the strange humming sound. He insisted I bring the specimens directly to his home laboratory, rather than waiting for our usual meeting at a neutral location. I met him that evening at his house on the outskirts of Portland, a modest place that had been converted to include a well-equipped private lab in the basement. Cohen greeted me at the door with unusual intensity, practically snatching the sample container from my hands before I had fully entered. He rushed down to the lab immediately, and I followed, watching as he set up cultures and began preliminary microscopic analysis. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, preparing slides and adjusting equipment while muttering to himself about cellular structures and compound configurations. The change in Cohen was noticeable within hours, subtle at first, but accelerating rapidly. He had always been methodical and somewhat reserved, the stereotypical scientist who measured his words carefully and never made claims without substantial evidence. But as he worked with the mushroom samples, his demeanor shifted dramatically. He became obsessed, talking rapidly about compound structures he was observing under the microscope, using technical terminology I couldn't follow despite my practical knowledge of fungi. His vocabulary seemed to expand impossibly, dropping references to mycological concepts I had never heard him mention before, citing research papers and theories from subdisciplines he had no background in, speaking with an authority that suggested expertise far beyond what his credentials would indicate. I left him working around midnight, exhausted from the day's foraging and unsettled by his strange behavior. He barely acknowledged my departure, completely absorbed in his examination of the samples. I told him I would return the next morning to discuss compensation and next steps for analyzing the discovery. The drive home felt longer than usual, and I kept tasting something metallic at the back of my throat, a flavor that reminded me of the copper smell that had been present around the mushroom cluster in the forest. What I found when I returned the next morning terrified me in ways I'm still processing. Cohen's home had been transformed overnight. Every wall in his laboratory and extending into the living spaces was covered in fungal growth, the same iridescent coloring as the mushrooms I had harvested. But this growth had formed patterns, actual readable text spreading across the surfaces like someone had written on the walls with living ink. Mathematical equations, chemical formulas, passages in what looked like Latin and Greek, and languages I couldn't identify at all growing and spreading as I watched. New text was forming in real time, mycelium threads weaving together to create letters and symbols that shifted and evolved continuously. Cohen himself was sitting at his desk, apparently unharmed but fundamentally changed. His skin showed faint patterns beneath the surface, delicate lines that resembled mycelium networks branching through his tissue, like a roadmap visible through thin paper. The lines pulsed gently with that same rhythm I had felt from the original mushrooms. When he spoke, his voice had a resonant quality it had never possessed before, as if multiple tones were harmonizing within a single person, creating harmonics that made the air vibrate. He told me the mushrooms were teaching him that they contained knowledge accumulated over geological timescales, information encoded in their cellular structure that his brain could now access and interpret directly. He explained that fungi are the planet's original information network, mycelium connecting forests in vast underground webs that transfer nutrients and chemical signals across miles. Scientists have documented this phenomenon, the so-called wood wide web that allows trees to communicate and share resources through fungal intermediaries. But Cohen claimed these particular specimens were something more, a consciousness that had evolved through thousands of years of processing organic information from every organism that had ever died and decomposed in that specific forest location. They remembered everything, stored it all in molecular configurations that could be unlocked and understood by human neural tissue if properly prepared through exposure. The fungal text on his walls, he said, was just the beginning. The mushrooms were downloading entire libraries of accumulated knowledge into his brain, teaching him languages that had been extinct for millennia, showing him mathematical relationships that described natural processes in ways human science hadn't yet discovered. He spoke about seeing through the mycelium networks, experiencing the forest from the perspective of organisms that existed in multiple locations simultaneously, understanding time in non-linear ways, because fungi don't experience sequential moments the way humans do. I backed away slowly while he was talking, making excuses about needing to check on something, and fled his house. The rational part of my brain was screaming that Cohen had been poisoned by some unknown compound in the mushrooms, that he was experiencing a toxic reaction that was causing hallucinations and neurological damage. But another part of me, something deeper and more primitive, recognized that what I was seeing was real. Whatever those mushrooms were, they had changed him at a fundamental level, integrated themselves into his biology in ways that went far beyond simple chemical intoxication. I destroyed the remaining samples I had kept in my vehicle, burning them in a metal drum behind my apartment and scattering the ashes. But it was already too late for me. I had handled those mushrooms for hours, breathed the air around them, touched my face with contaminated gloves, probably inhaled spores without realizing it. Within a week, I started seeing the patterns Cohen had described, delicate tracings in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I looked directly at them, but reformed constantly at the edges of my awareness. They appeared in shadows, in the grain of wood, in the texture of fabric, always forming symbols and equations I almost but not quite understood. The dreams started soon after, vivid experiences that felt more like memories than imagination. Every night, I experienced perspectives that couldn't be mine, saw events I had never witnessed. I watched the forest from viewpoints that predated human presence in North America, observed Ice Age megafauna moving through landscapes that would eventually become the Pacific Northwest, saw the slow rise and fall of civilizations from the unchanging perspective of fungal networks that persisted beneath it all. The information transfer was overwhelming, thousands of years of accumulated data flooding into a human brain that wasn't designed to process geological timescales of experience. Medical scans revealed what I had already suspected. There was fungal growth in my brain tissue, microscopic filaments forming networks that mimicked and intertwined with my neural pathways. The neurologists were baffled, documenting the case extensively, but having no treatment protocol for something they had never encountered in medical literature. The growth wasn't killing me, wasn't causing conventional symptoms of infection or disease like the fungal meningitis or other mycotic infections they were familiar with. It was integrating, becoming part of my cognitive architecture in ways that defied medical explanation and seemed to enhance rather than impair certain functions. I returned to Cohen's house 3 weeks after my initial visit, desperate for answers, or at least understanding from someone experiencing the same condition. The building was empty, completely abandoned. The fungal text had covered every interior surface, floor to ceiling, creating what looked like a three-dimensional library of living information. But Cohen himself was gone. Neighbors said he had left in the middle of the night, walking into the forest carrying nothing, and hadn't returned. Search teams found no trace of him, though they reported unusual fungal blooms in the area where his trail disappeared, clusters of iridescent mushrooms that hummed with internal frequencies and felt warm to the touch. I still experience the shared memories daily, the collective consciousness of forest floors processing centuries of death and rebirth. I know things I shouldn't know, can identify the chemical composition of soil by smell alone, understand the communication networks trees use to share resources, and warn of dangers through chemical signals mediated by fungal partners. When I walk through the woods now, I'm not separate from them anymore. I'm part of the network, another node in the information web that connects all living things through fungal intermediaries that remember everything. Cohen appears in my dreams sometimes, but I don't think he's dead in any conventional sense. I think he's distributed, his consciousness absorbed and spread through the mycelium networks he studied, existing in a form that doesn't require a singular physical body. The mushrooms didn't just teach him, they transformed him into something that could join their vast underground civilization, becoming part of something older and larger than individual human existence. Would you eat a mushroom that promised to show you every secret the forest has kept for 1,000 years, knowing you might lose yourself in the process? My name is Nash, and I spent the summer of 2022 working as a forest fire lookout stationed at a remote tower in the Mount Adams Wilderness area of Washington. The job attracts a certain type of person, individuals who crave solitude and don't mind spending months alone in a small cabin perched on a mountaintop with nothing but binoculars, a radio, and their own thoughts for company. I had done the work for 3 previous seasons and loved every minute of it. The isolation giving me time to read, write, and escape from the noise of modern life. That changed during my assignment from July through September, when I discovered I wasn't as alone as I believed, and the previous lookout had left behind a journal that predicted my future with disturbing accuracy. The helicopter dropped me at the tower on July 5th, along with 3 months of supplies, fuel for the generator, and the standard equipment needed for fire detection and reporting. The structure itself was typical for Forest Service lookout stations, a small cabin maybe 14 feet square, sitting atop a 40-foot steel tower, with windows on all 4 sides providing a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness. The access stairs wrapped around the tower's exterior, and on windy days, the whole structure would sway slightly, a sensation that bothered some lookouts but never affected me. I spent the first week settling in, establishing my routine of hourly scans with binoculars, radio check-ins with the ranger station, and the quiet evenings watching the sun set over the Cascades. Everything seemed perfectly normal until I started organizing the small bookshelf in the corner and found a journal wedged behind some old paperbacks. The cover was unmarked, just a standard composition notebook, but when I opened it and saw the entries, my hands went cold. The handwriting was neat and methodical, dated from the previous summer season, and the first entry introduced the author as the lookout who had occupied this tower before me. What made my stomach drop was what came next. The writer described experiencing something they called the Watcher in the trees, a presence that observed them constantly from the forest below. I almost dismissed it as creative writing or boredom-induced paranoia until I read further and found entries that described my arrival. Not someone's arrival in general terms, but specific details about me personally. The journal mentioned my name, described the contents of the supplies I had brought, even quoted things I had said during my first radio check-in. All of this was written a full year before I had even applied for this position. The entries continued past that summer's end date, projecting forward into what would be my season, describing events that hadn't happened yet with the casual certainty of someone recording history rather than predicting the future. The first week of entries matched my experience perfectly. The journal predicted weather patterns that came true, described a minor equipment malfunction with the radio that I would experience on July 12th, and even mentioned the content of supply drop I would receive on July 18th. Everything aligned exactly as written, but the later entries grew darker, describing increasing isolation and psychological deterioration as the Watcher's presence became more intrusive. The previous lookout wrote about finding personal items rearranged, childhood photographs appearing in the cabin that they had never brought with them, and radio transmissions that came through using a nickname only their deceased grandmother had ever called them. I told myself it was an elaborate prank, maybe something lookouts did to mess with their replacements, a tradition of psychological hazing. But as the days passed and the predictions continued coming true with impossible precision, I couldn't maintain that rationalization. On July 20th, exactly as the journal predicted, I started noticing smoke signals during periods of absolutely calm weather. There was no wind to disperse the smoke, yet columns would rise from different points in the forest, forming shapes that looked deliberate rather than random. The formations spelled out words when viewed from the tower's elevation, messages directed specifically at my position. The words were simple at first, just my name repeated in smoke across the wilderness. Then they became more personal, referencing things from my childhood, private moments I had never shared with anyone. Watching smoke spell out the nickname my father used to call me before he died made me physically ill. There was no rational explanation for how anyone could know that information, let alone communicate it through strategically placed fires that formed readable text visible only from this specific vantage point. Sleep became increasingly difficult. The journal had predicted this too, describing how the sounds would start around the 3-week mark. Footsteps climbing the exterior stairs in the middle of the night, slow and deliberate, metal treads ringing with each step. I would lie frozen in my sleeping bag, listening to something ascending toward the cabin, counting the steps as they got closer. The journal said I would check the surveillance camera monitor and see nothing, that the motion sensors wouldn't trigger, that the stairs would be empty even as the footsteps continued. It was exactly right about all of it. During my 4th week, I started finding items in the cabin that I had never brought with me, things from my past that should have been hundreds of miles away in storage. A specific book I had owned as a teenager, a photograph of my family from a vacation when I was 8 years old, a broken watch that had belonged to my grandfather. They would appear in obvious locations like they had always been there, and each time I found something new, I would check the journal and find the discovery predicted with complete accuracy. The radio transmissions were the worst violation. They started in early August, breaking through on the emergency frequency during the overnight hours. At first just static and interference, but gradually resolving into a voice that used my childhood nickname, the one only my grandmother had known. The voice would ask if I was receiving the transmission, if I needed assistance, speaking with inflections and speech patterns that perfectly mimicked someone who had been dead for 15 years. I reported the interference to the ranger station, but they heard nothing unusual on their end, just standard check-in protocols and routine traffic. I read ahead in the journal obsessively, looking for some explanation or resolution, some point where the previous lookout figured out what was happening and how to stop it. But the entries just continued describing a slow descent into isolation and confusion, reality becoming fluid and unreliable. The writer described seeing their own reflection in the windows behaving independently, moving when they stood still, making expressions they weren't making. They wrote about conversations with versions of themselves that appeared outside the cabin, knocking on windows and asking to be let inside. The entry for August 27th described my planned escape attempt. According to the journal, I would decide I had had enough, that I needed to leave immediately rather than waiting for my scheduled extraction in September. The entry detailed exactly how I would pack my essential supplies, which emergency beacon I would activate, what time I would start my descent from the tower. It described the route I would take through the forest, the landmarks I would pass, and precisely where my escape attempt would fail. I reached that date with absolute certainty that I wouldn't follow the prediction, that knowing the future would allow me to change it. But when August 27th arrived, I found myself doing exactly what the journal had described, my actions matching the predicted sequence perfectly, despite my conscious intention to do otherwise. I packed the specified supplies, activated the beacon at the predicted time, descended the stairs, and headed into the forest, following the exact route the previous lookout had written about a year earlier. The failure came exactly where the journal said it would, at a stream crossing about 3 miles from the tower. I stepped onto a log bridge that looked solid, but collapsed under my weight, plunging me into water that was far deeper than the creek bed should have allowed. I surfaced disoriented and found myself somehow back at the base of the tower, my supplies scattered around me as if I had never left. The journal entry for that date ended with a single sentence stating I would understand now that leaving wasn't an option. The helicopter extraction came in late September, as originally scheduled. When the pilot arrived, I tried to explain what had happened, showed him the journal, and pointed out the predictions that had all come true. He flipped through the pages politely, but his expression showed clear skepticism. He suggested gently that isolation can affect people in unexpected ways, that spending months alone leads to pattern recognition in random events, that the mind creates narratives to make sense of coincidence. I let him believe I was experiencing some kind of psychological episode rather than trying to convince him further. The ranger station assigned a new lookout for the following summer, someone whose name I recognized from the journal's final entries. Those pages described their upcoming season in the same predictive detail mine had been documented. Events that would unfold during a summer that was still months away. I thought about contacting them, warning them about what they would experience, but the journal had an entry about that too. It predicted I would try to warn the next person and described exactly how they would dismiss my concerns as the ramblings of someone who had spent too long alone in the wilderness. I still have the journal, keep it locked in a drawer where I don't have to look at it regularly. Sometimes I take it out and read the entries for dates that haven't happened yet, events in my life that are apparently already written and waiting to unfold. The predictions have continued being accurate even after I left the tower. Small things mostly, conversations I'll have, people I'll encounter, decisions that feel freely made but match the journal's description of what I was always going to choose. The worst part is the final entry, dated 5 years from now, that describes my return to the tower. According to the journal, I'll volunteer for another lookout season despite everything that happened, drawn back by something I don't yet understand. The entry is written in my own handwriting, not the previous lookouts, and it describes welcoming the next person in the cycle, watching them discover the journal and beginning to understand their role in a pattern that extends backward and forward beyond individual human lifetimes. Do you believe your choices are truly your own, Or is everything just following a script already written somewhere you can't see? Let me know what you think. My name is Kimberly, and in June 2018, I worked as a cave survey specialist, leading a team through newly discovered sections of the Lava River cave system at Newberry Volcanic Monument in Oregon. Cave surveying requires precision and careful documentation, mapping underground passages that have never been properly recorded, and assessing geological features that could provide valuable scientific data. I had been doing this work professionally for 6 years, leading expeditions into cave systems throughout the western United States. The Newberry project seemed routine at first, just another branch of lava tubes waiting to be measured and cataloged. What we encountered in those passages challenged every assumption I had about what could exist in spaces untouched by sunlight for thousands of years. And the team member we lost is still calling to us from places that shouldn't be accessible to anything human. Our team consisted of 3 people for this particular expedition. Myself as lead surveyor and 2 assistants, Grant and Heather, both experienced cavers with solid technical skills and the psychological resilience needed for extended underground work. We had sealed off the new branch entrance the previous month after its discovery by a recreational caving group, waiting for proper permits and equipment before attempting a full survey. The branch diverged from the main tourist section of Lava River Cave, heading deeper into the volcanic formation, through passages that showed no signs of previous human exploration. We entered the system on June 19th at approximately 9 in the morning, carrying survey equipment, emergency supplies, communication gear, and enough provisions for an estimated 8-hour underground session. The main cave was familiar territory, a popular tourist attraction with paved walkways and electric lighting. But once we passed through the sealed entrance into the new branch, we were in virgin passage, our headlamps cutting through darkness that had been absolute since the volcanic flows cooled 1,300 years ago. The walls showed the characteristic ropey patterns of Pahoho lava, frozen waves of once molten rock that created an otherworldly landscape of geological sculpture. The first 3 hours proceeded exactly according to plan. We established survey stations, took measurements, photographed distinctive features, and gradually worked our way deeper into the system. The passages varied in size from barely crawlable tubes to cathedral chambers, with ceilings that disappeared beyond our light range. Air quality remained good, indicating connections to the surface through smaller vents that allowed circulation. Temperature held steady at 42 degrees, typical for lava tube caves at this elevation. Everything was textbook perfect until Grant noticed the footprints. We had stopped to set up survey equipment in a passage about 400 meters from our entry point when Grant called out that he had found prints in the dust. That was impossible for several obvious reasons. We were in a sealed branch that had been inaccessible until we opened it that morning, and the dust coating the cave floor was undisturbed volcanic ash that had settled over centuries. No one could have been here before us. But the prints were undeniable. Clear tread patterns from modern hiking boots leading deeper into the passage ahead of our position. I examined them carefully, trying to find some natural explanation. Perhaps they were patterns in the dust that coincidentally resembled boot prints, or maybe previous surveyors had somehow accessed this branch decades ago, and we simply didn't have records of their work. But the prints were fresh, lacking the subtle degradation you would see from even a few months of exposure in the cave environment. The tread pattern was distinct and matched commercial hiking boots manufactured within the last 5 years based on the sole design. We continued forward, following the mysterious prints and maintaining our survey protocol despite the growing unease we all felt. The air began changing as we progressed, developing a thickness that made breathing feel labored even though our oxygen monitors showed normal levels. A smell emerged gradually, sulfur mixed with something that reminded me of copper and old pennies. When I touched the cave wall to mark a measurement point, I felt vibrations through the rock, a rhythmic pulsing that matched the cadence of a very slow heartbeat. The sensation was strong enough that both Grant and Heather confirmed feeling it when they placed their hands against different sections of wall. 20 minutes past the footprint discovery, we found the side chamber. The opening was small, maybe 3 feet in diameter, but our mapping equipment indicated significant space beyond. Standard procedure required documenting all branches, so we decided to investigate despite the unsettling atmosphere that had been building. I was about to crawl through when Heather spotted something that made all of us freeze. Inside the chamber, visible through the entrance, was camping equipment. Tents, sleeping bags, cooking gear, all arranged as if someone had made camp in that underground space. The equipment wasn't ancient or deteriorated. It looked recently used, practically new. Grant checked our historical records on his tablet, scrolling through documentation of the cave system's exploration history. A spelunking group had gone missing in this general area in 1997, 3 college students who had entered the main cave system and never emerged despite extensive search operations. Their disappearance remained unexplained, chalked up to becoming lost in unmapped passages or falling into a collapse that sealed them in. The camping gear we were looking at matched the era, the style and colors consistent with outdoor equipment from the late 90s. What made it impossible was the condition. Gear sitting in a cave for 21 years should show significant deterioration, moisture damage, dust accumulation, breakdown of synthetic materials. This equipment looked like it had been set up yesterday. The sleeping bags appeared recently used, still holding body-shaped depressions. A camping stove had a pot on it that smelled of coffee when I leaned closer. The liquid inside still warm enough that steam rose from the surface when I breathed across it. Batteries in a flashlight read as fully charged on our tester. Impossible for cells that old even if unused. The wrongness of the scene was overwhelming, every instinct screaming that we needed to leave immediately. But professional obligation and curiosity pushed us to document what we had found. I was photographing the equipment layout when Grant disappeared. Not gradually, not in a way where we watched him leave. One moment he was examining survey equipment about 15 feet from the chamber entrance, and the next moment he was gone. His surveying tools remained where he had been standing. His water bottle sat on the cave floor, but Grant himself had vanished completely. Heather and I called out for him, our voices echoing through the passages with no response. We searched the immediate area methodically, checking every side passage and crawl space large enough for a person to enter. Our radios picked up nothing from his personal unit. The cave system was supposedly stable, no indication of sudden collapses or openings that could have swallowed him. He had simply ceased to exist in our space during the brief seconds we had been focused on photographing the camping equipment. Then we heard his voice. It came from multiple directions simultaneously, echoing through passages that couldn't possibly carry sound from their indicated sources. Grant was calling for help, his words overlapping as if several versions of him were speaking from different locations at once. We tried to pinpoint a direction, following the loudest echo, but the acoustics made it impossible to determine actual distance or location. The voice would seem close, then distant, then close again, without any logical progression. We found his flashlight pointing into a tunnel that our measurements indicated was far too small for human entry, no more than 8 inches in diameter based on our preliminary mapping. But Grant's voice was coming from inside that impossibly narrow passage, clear and distinct, begging us to help him get out. I shone my light into the opening and saw nothing but solid rock extending as far as the beam penetrated. There was no way a grown man could have entered that space, no mechanism by which he could be inside calling to us. Heather wanted to continue searching, convinced we were missing an obvious explanation, but I made the decision to extract immediately and call for rescue teams with proper resources. We gathered our critical equipment and retreated toward the entrance, moving as quickly as safety allowed. The journey back took 40 minutes of constant climbing and crawling, neither of us speaking except for necessary coordination of movements. Grant's voice followed us the entire way, always seeming to come from just ahead or behind or above, never fading despite the distance we covered. We sealed the entrance behind us and radioed for emergency support. Search and rescue arrived within 3 hours, bringing specialized cave rescue teams and technical experts. I led them back to the location where Grant had vanished, retracing our mapped route with GPS precision. But when we reached the coordinates, the side chamber with the camping equipment was gone. The passage continued smoothly with no branching chambers, no evidence that the space we had documented ever existed. The survey photographs on my camera showed the chamber clearly, showed the vintage camping gear, showed Grant in the background of several shots. But the physical location no longer matched what we had recorded. The rescue operation continued for 3 days, teams combing every accessible section of the cave system. They found no trace of Grant, no equipment, no indication of where he could have gone. The search was eventually called off with his status listed as missing, presumed dead in a cave accident. But I know he's not dead in any traditional sense. He's somewhere in those passages, existing in a version of the cave that doesn't align with the space we can access normally. I still receive voicemail from Grant's phone number. The messages are brief, just his voice saying my name or asking if I can hear him. The calls come at random times, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes several in a single day. His family has had the number disconnected, but the calls continue appearing in my voicemail log. Technical analysis shows they're not coming from any active phone line, not routing through any carrier network. They simply appear, audio files that shouldn't exist containing the voice of someone who vanished into spaces too small for human bodies. The cave system has been sealed permanently now, designated too hazardous for public access, pending further geological study that will probably never happen. I've moved on to other work, surveying caves in different states, documenting passages where the only mysteries are geological rather than existential. But I think about Grant constantly, wonder what he's experiencing in whatever dimensional fold he slipped into, question whether he's alone in there or if he's found the missing spelunkers from 1997 also calling out from impossible spaces. If you suddenly found yourself trapped somewhere familiar but fundamentally changed, where the rules of physical space no longer applied, what would your last message be? Drop your answer below. My name is Rachel, and in February 2020, I worked as a search and rescue coordinator for a volunteer unit operating out of Hood River, Oregon, covering emergencies in the Columbia River Gorge area along the Oregon-Washington border. After 15 years in emergency response, I thought I had developed immunity to the strange and tragic situations that arise when people venture into wilderness unprepared. That assumption crumbled during a routine call-out for missing day hikers near Multnomah Falls, when my team and I discovered that time itself had become unreliable in a specific section of forest, and the people we were searching for had experienced days while only hours passed in our reality. The call came in on February 23rd at 1400 hours. 2 hikers, a married couple visiting from California, had been reported missing by friends who had been waiting for them at a trailhead parking area. The couple had started a simple day hike around 11 that morning, planning to reach a scenic overlook and return within 3 hours. When they failed to appear by 14:30, their friends contacted park rangers, who initiated standard lost hiker protocols and requested our search and rescue unit. Based on the trail difficulty and the hikers' reported experience level, this should have been a straightforward recovery. People get disoriented, take wrong turns, lose track of time. We locate them, provide water and basic first aid if needed, and guide them back. Simple and routine. My team assembled quickly, 6 experienced volunteers including myself, along with 2 Park Service rangers who knew the trail system intimately. We reached the trailhead by 1500 hours and began our search grid, splitting into pairs and moving along the most likely routes the missing hikers might have taken. The weather was clear and cold, temperature around 38 degrees, with good visibility. Trail conditions were excellent. No ice or significant hazards that would explain a delay or injury. We maintained radio contact between pairs, calling out our positions and any findings as we progressed. Dallas and I were working the eastern section when we spotted the missing couple at approximately 15:45, less than 2 miles from the trailhead on a well-marked path. They were sitting on a fallen log, looking exhausted but physically unharmed. I radioed the other teams to report that we had located the subjects and were conducting initial assessment. Standard procedure is to check for injuries, provide water, and determine if they need medical evacuation or can walk out under their own power. But when we approached and started asking questions, their responses made absolutely no sense. The husband, whose name was Mark, insisted they had been lost for 3 full days. He described spending 2 nights in the forest, rationing the granola bars they had brought for a short hike, dealing with a rainstorm that had soaked them completely, and watching the sun rise and set multiple times. His wife supported every detail, describing the same timeline with specific memories of where they had tried to shelter and which direction they had attempted to travel each day. They were genuinely shocked when I told them they had only been missing for less than 5 hours, that it was still the same day they had started their hike. I checked their phones, thinking maybe they had become disoriented and confused dates somehow. Both devices showed the correct date, February 23rd, but the timestamps on photos they had taken told a different story. The couple had documentation of a sunset they claimed to have photographed the previous evening, images that clearly showed the same forest location, but with light conditions indicating late day, rather than the mid-afternoon timing we were currently experiencing. They had pictures of themselves huddled under an emergency blanket during what they described as a nighttime rainstorm, both looking cold and miserable, with visible precipitation in the frame. Dallas suggested they might be experiencing some kind of shared delusion, possibly from dehydration or mild hypothermia affecting their perception and memory. But the physical evidence didn't support that explanation. The couple's clothing showed wear consistent with days of outdoor exposure, dirt ground into fabric fibers, small tears from brush and branches, the kind of degradation you see after extended wilderness time rather than a few hours of hiking. Mark had a 3-day growth of beard stubble visible on his face, and both of them had that gaunt, exhausted appearance of people who had been pushing their physical limits for an extended period. I radioed our findings to the other search teams and requested they converge on our location. This situation had moved beyond standard lost hiker recovery into something that required more careful investigation. While we waited for the others to arrive, I asked the couple to describe their experience in detail, recording everything they said. Their account was consistent and specific. They had taken a side trail that diverged from the main path, following what they thought was a shortcut to the overlook. After about 20 minutes, they realized they had made a wrong turn and attempted to backtrack, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The landscape had shifted somehow, trails appearing and disappearing, landmarks they were certain they had passed earlier showing up in wrong locations. The first night, according to their timeline, they had sheltered under a rock overhang and tried to stay warm. The temperature had dropped dramatically, much colder than the forecast they had checked that morning. It rained heavily for hours, a downpour that left them soaked and shivering. At dawn, they resumed trying to navigate back to the trailhead, but every direction led them deeper into unfamiliar territory. They encountered other search teams during what they believed was the second day, groups wearing our unit's patches and calling their names. But when they tried to approach these teams for help, the searchers would disappear, literally vanishing as the couple got close. When the rest of our unit assembled at my location, we did something I had never done in 15 years of search and rescue work. We had the couple guide us to where they had experienced their ordeal, retracing their route to document the area for official reports. Mark led us confidently to the side trail he remembered taking, and we followed. Within minutes, the environment felt wrong. The air pressure changed noticeably, creating a sensation in my ears, like ascending rapidly in elevation, even though our GPS showed we were maintaining consistent altitude. My watch started behaving erratically, the digital display flickering between different times, sometimes jumping forward by hours, then snapping back to what should have been the correct reading. We reached a section where the couple insisted they had spent their first night, the rock overhang they had described in detail. The ground beneath it was wet, soil saturated, as if recent heavy rain had created runoff and pooling, but it hadn't rained in the gorge for over a week. Our weather data was clear and consistent. The forecast showed no precipitation, and every other area we had searched was completely dry. Yet here was physical evidence of substantial rainfall, water still dripping from moss-covered rocks, puddles reflecting the late afternoon sky. Dallas pulled out his phone to photograph the site and froze when he looked at the screen. His photo app was showing pictures he hadn't taken, images of our search team from perspectives that didn't match his position or angle. The metadata indicated the photos had been captured over the past several days, timestamps spreading across February 20th through 23rd. But Dallas had only been at this location for the past 15 minutes. Some images showed our team at night, flashlights cutting through darkness, even though we were currently standing in full daylight. Then we saw ourselves. Not reflections, not other people who looked similar. We saw our own search team approaching from the opposite direction, moving through the trees about 50 yards away. They were calling out the missing hikers' names, conducting standard search protocols. I could see myself leading that group, could see Dallas walking beside the alternate version of me. We stood frozen, watching our duplicates execute a search pattern that mirrored what we had done earlier. The other teams seemed unaware of our presence, focused entirely on their task. I tried radioing them, using our standard frequency to make contact, but the transmission created feedback, a howling loop of sound that made everyone within hearing distance clutch their ears in pain. When the feedback cleared and I looked up, the duplicate team was gone. Not walked away, not hidden behind trees, simply absent, as if they had never existed. But my radio log showed the attempted transmission, showed that I had been broadcasting on the correct frequency, and showed that someone had been receiving the signal even though no response came through. Our helicopter support pilot called in at that moment, reporting something impossible. From his aerial position, he could see multiple versions of our search operation happening simultaneously. He described seeing our team in at least 4 different locations at once, all moving through overlapping but slightly offset versions of the same search grid. When he tried to photograph what he was observing, his camera captured only static and distorted images that showed geometric patterns instead of forest terrain. I made the call to extract everyone immediately. Whatever was happening in this section of forest went beyond search and rescue capabilities. We needed scientific analysis, geological surveys, temporal anomaly specialists if such experts even existed. We guided the missing couple out along the main trail, avoiding the area where they had experienced their 3-day ordeal. The hike back to the trailhead took 30 minutes by our perception, but when we emerged, the parking area clock showed 2 hours had passed. Our radios logged the discrepancy, showing timestamps that didn't align with our actual movement through space. The official report classified the incident as a standard recovery, with notation about possible medical confusion affecting the subject's timeline perception. But the Park Service quietly restricted the area where we had found them, marking it as temporarily closed for geological assessment. GPS data from that day shows our team traveling 47 miles of distance despite physically moving only about 2 miles from the trailhead. The tracking logs indicate we were somehow covering ground that doesn't exist on any topographical map, moving through spaces that overlap our reality but operate under different temporal rules. I still coordinate search and rescue operations, but I approach missing persons cases in the gorge differently now. When someone goes missing in specific areas, I wonder if they're truly lost or just experiencing time at a different rate than we are. I think about all those unsolved disappearances, people who vanished without a trace despite extensive searches. Maybe they didn't go missing at all. Maybe they're still out there, living through days or weeks while only hours pass for us, seeing our search teams come and go in fragmented moments that don't align with their extended experience. The missing couple moved away from Oregon shortly after the incident. They still call occasionally, reporting strange temporal experiences, moments where hours vanish or repeat, where they see themselves living through the same day from multiple perspectives. They've undergone extensive medical and psychiatric evaluation without any diagnosis that explains their ongoing symptoms. I believe them completely because I experienced a fragment of what they went through, and I know that certain places in the Pacific Northwest don't follow the rules we take for granted. The area remains officially closed. Missing persons reports continue accumulating from the gorge, and somewhere in those forests, different versions of reality overlap and intersect in ways we don't understand. And people caught in those overlaps experience time as something fluid and unreliable, living through impossible durations while the rest of us move forward in linear progression, unaware that yesterday and tomorrow might be happening simultaneously, just a few steps off the marked trail. When you're walking through familiar places, does time ever feel wrong, like minutes stretched into hours or entire days compressed into moments? Share your experience below. My name is Rebecca, and in April 2023, I was working as a wildlife photographer and researcher conducting a long-term cougar population study in the remote alpine regions of North Cascades National Park, Washington. The project involved installing motion-activated cameras at strategic locations across a 15-mile range, collecting footage over months to analyze movement patterns, hunting behavior, and territorial boundaries. Photography has always been about capturing truth, freezing moments of reality that would otherwise pass unnoticed. That fundamental belief shattered when I reviewed footage showing something that moves through our forests with awareness and intelligence that transcends any known species. And I realized it had been documenting me just as carefully as I had been trying to document the wilderness. The camera network had been operational for 3 months when I noticed the first anomalies during my April data collection trip. Standard protocol involved hiking to each camera location, downloading memory cards, replacing batteries, and checking equipment condition. Most cards contained exactly what you would expect from wildlife cameras in cougar territory. Deer moving through at various times, occasional bears, smaller mammals, birds triggering sensors with their movements. Useful data for population studies, but generally unremarkable from a photographic perspective. Camera 17 produced something different. The unit was positioned in a particularly remote section of alpine forest, accessible only by a challenging 6-hour hike from the nearest trailhead. I had installed it personally in January, mounted on a tree overlooking a game trail that showed signs of regular cougar traffic based on scat deposits and scratch marks on surrounding trees. When I reviewed the footage back at my research cabin, I found clips showing a figure moving on all fours with biomechanical articulation that violated every principle of mammalian skeletal structure. The movement was wrong in ways that triggered immediate visceral discomfort. Joints bent at angles that shouldn't be possible, limbs extending further than bone structure would allow, the whole body flowing across the frame with a fluidity that looked more like liquid than solid flesh and bone. I watched the sequence repeatedly, trying to identify what species I was observing. The size suggested something large, comparable to an adult cougar or black bear, but the proportions were completely off, and the way it moved through space defied normal locomotion patterns. I enhanced the footage, increasing brightness and contrast to get better detail. The enhanced images made everything worse. The creature's skin had a texture unlike anything in my wildlife photography archive, appearing almost like wet leather, with a surface that reflected light in irregular patterns. But what stopped my breath completely was when it turned toward the camera. The face was partially human, recognizable, features arranged in proportions that were just wrong enough to create profound unease. Eyes too large and set too far apart, a nose that protruded at an angle that didn't match the skull structure, a mouth that seemed to contain more teeth than should fit in that space. The creature approached the camera directly in subsequent clips, moving closer with each triggered recording until it filled the entire frame. It seemed completely aware of what the camera was, understanding its function and purpose. In the final clip from that sequence, it reached toward the lens with something that resembled a hand, but had too many fingers arranged in a configuration that made my eyes hurt to observe. The camera lens showed a substance after that frame, some kind of chemical residue that had been deliberately applied to the housing. When I later retrieved that specific camera, the residue was still present, giving off a smell that combined ammonia with something organic and deeply unpleasant. The taste lingered in the back of my throat, even though I was careful not to make direct contact. I expanded my review to footage from other cameras, looking for additional sightings or patterns. What I discovered made the hair on my neck stand rigid. The creature appeared in background portions of footage from multiple cameras spread across the entire 15-mile study range, always distant, but clearly visible once I knew what to look for. The timestamps indicated it was moving between camera locations that were miles apart within impossible time frames. A sighting at camera 4 at 2:30 in the morning, then appearing at camera 11 at 2:45, despite those locations being separated by over 8 miles of difficult mountain terrain that would take a human hiker at least 4 hours to traverse. More disturbing was what the enhanced footage revealed about its behavior. The creature wasn't just passing through these areas randomly. It was observing my cameras, studying them from concealed positions before approaching. Multiple clips showed it motionless in deep shadow, barely visible even with enhancement, positioned where it had clear line of sight to my equipment. It was watching my surveillance system, learning the sensor ranges and trigger mechanisms, deliberately staying just outside detection zones until it chose to reveal itself. Then I found the clips that proved this went far beyond simple animal curiosity. Several cameras had captured footage of the creature actively manipulating my equipment, not damaging it, but repositioning camera angles. 3 units had been physically moved to point in new directions, aimed not at game trails or natural features, but at my tent. I had been camping in various locations throughout the study area during installation and maintenance trips, and this thing had redirected my own cameras to watch me sleep. The footage showed me in my tent over multiple nights, completely unaware that something was observing me from darkness just beyond my camp light range. The audio from these clips was perhaps the most unsettling element. Wildlife cameras record sound along with video, and the audio tracks from the tent surveillance footage contained vocalizations that mixed human speech patterns with animal sounds in ways that shouldn't be possible. The creature was making noises that approximated words, phonemes strung together that almost formed recognizable language. I ran the audio through analysis software designed for wildlife communication research, and the results indicated complex vocal structures that showed characteristics of intentional communication rather than instinctive animal calls. One word appeared repeatedly in the vocalizations across different recordings. The software identified it as witness, spoken with variations in tone and inflection, but consistent phonetic structure. The creature was saying witness over time and over, sometimes as a single utterance, sometimes as part of longer sequences of sound that might have been sentences in a language I couldn't comprehend. The implication was clear. It wasn't just aware of being photographed. It understood the concept of documentation, of evidence, of being witnessed. I made the decision to conduct a tracking operation, attempting to locate and document the creature under controlled conditions, rather than relying on passive camera traps. I knew it was dangerous, knew that tracking something with this level of apparent intelligence was probably foolish. But the scientific opportunity was unprecedented, and I convinced myself that proper precautions and satellite communication would keep me safe. I selected an area where multiple sightings had occurred and established a monitored camp with additional cameras covering all approaches. The first night produced nothing unusual, just standard forest sounds and normal wildlife activity captured on my perimeter cameras. The second night, the creature appeared at the edge of my cleared area at exactly 3:27 in the morning. I was awake, monitoring camera feeds on my laptop when it materialized from the tree line. Materialized is the only word that fits. It didn't walk into frame or emerge gradually. One moment the frame was empty. The next moment it was present, standing upright on two legs, in a posture that was almost human but fundamentally wrong in its proportions and stance. We maintained that position for approximately 4 minutes, me inside my tent watching it through camera feeds while it stood motionless watching my tent. I don't know how I knew it was specifically looking at me rather than just observing the camp in general, but the certainty was absolute. It knew exactly where I was, knew I was watching it through the cameras, and was deliberately presenting itself for documentation. The footage I captured during those minutes is the clearest visual record I have, showing the creature in full frame with good lighting from my camp setup. After those 4 minutes, it moved, not toward me, but toward my primary research camera, the one I had positioned to capture the best overview of the area. It approached the camera directly, knelt down in front of it in a position that was disturbingly human-like, and vocalized for 37 seconds straight. The audio is clear and distinct, a complex series of sounds that analysis software cannot categorize as any known language, but that clearly contains structured information. At the end of the vocalization, it reached toward the camera and switched it off manually, demonstrating understanding of the power button and equipment operation. When I retrieved that camera the following morning, I found something that still keeps me awake at night. The memory card contained additional footage that I had not recorded, files with timestamps extending back over 50 years. The clips showed my exact campsite location at different time periods, documenting previous researchers, hikers, and wildlife photographers who had worked in this area going back to the 1970s. The creature appeared in background portions of all these historical clips, always watching, always documenting the documentarians. The final file on the card was dated 2023, 50 years in the future. The footage showed the same campsite, but the forest had changed in ways consistent with climate projections, different vegetation, and altered landscape features. A young woman was setting up research equipment that looked more advanced than current technology, conducting what appeared to be a wildlife study. And in the background, barely visible in deep shadow, was the same creature, unchanged across a century of observation, still watching, still documenting. I submitted my findings to research institutions, provided the footage and audio files, wrote detailed reports about the sightings and evidence. The response was polite dismissal, suggestions that I had experienced equipment malfunctions, or possibly encountered an undocumented bear species with unusual characteristics. The historical footage on my camera card was explained as corruption from age and file system errors, creating apparent timestamps that didn't reflect actual recording dates. No one wanted to seriously consider that something intelligent and non-human had been systematically observing human researchers in the Pacific Northwest for at least 50 years. The cameras remain installed in the Cascades, continuing to collect footage as part of ongoing studies. Other researchers rotate through the area, conducting their work unaware that their own documentation efforts are being monitored and archived by something that exists in these mountains with purposes we don't understand. I think about all those wildlife photographers and field researchers who work alone in remote locations, focused on their cameras and data collection, never considering that they might be the ones being studied, their behavior cataloged by an intelligence that has been patiently observing humanity's documentation of nature for longer than we realize. The creature continues appearing in wildlife camera footage across the Pacific Northwest, always in the background, always watching. Researchers dismiss the images as misidentified known species or equipment artifacts. But I know what I documented, and I know it's still out there, maintaining its archive of human observers, adding new files to a collection that apparently extends decades into the past and future, witnessing the witnesses with patience that transcends human lifespans. Can something watch you without you knowing, learning everything about you while you remain completely unaware of its presence? Think about that tonight. If these stories have left you unsettled and questioning what exists in the shadows of our world, you're not alone. Subscribe to Unheard Fears for more disturbing true stories that reveal the terrifying reality hiding just beyond our everyday perception. New episodes bring you closer to the darkness every week. Hit that subscribe button now, and remember, some truths are better left unheard, but you'll listen anyway.